And welcome to Let Them Talk. I'm Paul DeRienzo, and we're pleased to have you join us with our guest, Nalini Lasiewicz, who's come all the way from Los Angeles to join us here in New York City in the middle of a snowstorm. Why would anybody come from a beautiful, sunny, balmy Los Angeles to a freezing cold, snowy, early winter New York City?
Well, I'm so happy to be
we were bringing
here.
you through the slush and the ice
That's
over
right.
here to get down here to the studio.
And getting traction on my shoes. We left 80-degree weather to get here. But my niece is getting married in a couple days. I'm also visiting my sister who lives in West Harlem, and I'm visiting relatives, and also a bunch of friends from the work I did in the Bosnia crisis when there was a war in former Yugoslavia. I have several friends here in New York City visiting you. It's great to be here.
Right, great, thank you. And I visited you last year, which was great. We had a great time in Los Angeles last year. So,
you almost moved to Los Angeles at one point, didn't you?
Well, I love California. Yeah,
kept you here.
I know New York grabbed me. I know I did spend a lot of time in California.
You do like California, though.
I like it a lot. I spent a lot of time from the north all the way to the south.
Well, we love you there.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. I might come out yet one day, and live there. So, we're here now, Nalini, to talk about a lot of things because, as you just said, you're here for family business, but you're also going to be talking to people about the movement, and you're a musician as well, and you wrote sort of a topical folk rock type music that's aimed towards this issue that's close to your heart, which is what happened in the 1990s and what's happening till today in the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and those places. And you sort of took, well, tell us a little bit about the position. What was happening there? What got you involved? Why did you get involved in the Bosnia struggle,
it's interesting
Serbia,
because
and
it
all
was
that?
a point in my life. My husband and I just sold a business that we had run for 10 years called Showbiz Expo, a trade show. And some of the women I knew and women in film were getting the first footage that was coming out of the Balkans in 1992. And this is when a massive genocide was building and taking steam in parts of Croatia and in Bosnia especially. And this ethnic bloodshed just shocked me to smithereens. I am from Holland. My family and my parents lived through World War II. And you thought that that was going to be the end of this kind of slaughter. And when I found out that people were being killed because of their ethnic background, I was just shocked into action. And I spent 5 years. I started a little foundation, came to New York several times, came to Washington several times. And what we tried to do was lift the arms embargo so the people in Sarajevo and some of the other enclaves could maybe defend themselves. But since that didn't happen, we tried humanitarian aid, and we tried very hard to get the world to pay attention and stop that bloodshed. It was a terrible time. And it was a small group of people nationally who we were also confused. We were told by people that these people have been fighting each other for thousands of years. And so you're supposed to just accept it. And, the Yugoslavs that I knew said, no, for 50 years, this was the brotherhood of Slavs, and we all go to each other's churches, we celebrate each other's holidays and family events. And due to a very, I would call, deliberate disinformation campaign from several angles, people were forced into ethnic enclaves, and the war was shockingly violent and a terrible.
Moved you to create?
Well, when I started writing these songs, I had already the Dayton Peace Accords had been signed, and so the immediate bloodshed was, reduced, and everybody had time to think. And the one song that we were talking about today, this was dedicated to an aid worker from Japan named Shinya Sui. He was a university student in Oregon. And he became part of a network of Students Against Genocide. And our friend Sherry Fink, who I'm also seeing in New York this week, she actually ended up, after medical school, she went back to Bosnia and she wrote a book about what happened in one of the enclaves called Srebrenica. And there was a very small handful of medical professionals who took care of a town of 50,000 refugees for years on end, without any supplies, without any access to the outside world. Sherry wrote a book about that, and then more recently she wrote the book that's right now on the New York Times top 10 list for this year called 5 Days of Memorial, following the events, the tragic events of the Memorial Hospital during Katrina.
Sure.
Humanitarian aid workers are the most extraordinary human beings, and Shin was an example of this. He left everything, his studies, his family, his kind of strict family in Japan. He was an independent, quiet soul. He went into the middle of a war zone and tried to help ethnic teenagers be able to live and work and relate to one another again. Sure. So the songs I wrote were stories about some of their life.
So the first song we're going to listen to now?
This is called A Voice Within. Shin, the fellow I was just mentioning, he was a poet, he was an artist, he lived very humbly, and he passed away several years, a couple of years after the peace agreement. He was in a tragic accident and lost his life coming into Bosnia. And so it's called A Voice Within. And as people pass away, they become a light in your own life, and that's where the lyrics to this song come from, is recognizing him as he lives in us now.
So we'll listen to it now, and people will see us smiling as we listen. But go ahead.
Thank you.
The story will be told. The story will be told. Now that you've left us, I can see you better than before. I feel a windy storm was blowing through your caring soul. A voice within. You gave of yourself, listening to people who were cast away, offering friendship at a time when all love was blown away. A voice within. Your life was cut short. Tears overwhelmed me and those you left behind. We will carry your memory inside us. A burning, brilliant light. A voice within.
All right, Nalini Lasiewicz, beautiful. Thank you for letting us play that on
Thanks
M&M.
for letting me share it.
Let them talk. All right, wow. So that was talking about your friend, aid worker, who tragically died working to help people in the former Yugoslavia during that bloody war in the 1990s. All right, so that was somewhat. The next phase of this discussion I want to have with you is, of course, how we got to know each other and become friends because of the Pacifica Civil War, right, as they called it in those days.
Yeah, when I was active on the Balkan issue, was able to produce some radio shows at KPFK, which is a sister station to WBAI.
WBAI is a radio station, 99.5 FM here in New York, part of the Pacifica Foundation,
Yep.
5 stations.
5 stations.
And KPFK is the Los Angeles station.
Yes, no, I've been listening to KPFK since the 60s. My mom used to listen to jazz, you know, on the station, and always have loved it. And when we sold our business, actually, I went back into the station and I started volunteering. And we produced a number of radio shows that were, it was a very unusual opportunity because the mass media, you know, was ignoring the story.
Yeah.
And here this little volunteer, you know, donation-based group was willing to pay the very expensive phone charges into the Balkans, and, you know, things were a lot more expensive. I was spending like $800 a month just on
phone calls were expensive in those days.
on AOL.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Wow.
it was crazy how
early computer days, right?
Exactly. You know how much more expensive things were back then. But so they invested and they allowed us to tell the story. So I got real active with KPFK, and the station manager was a terrific guy. Mark Shub is the name, and he was part of a movement of people that, for the prior, I'd say 5 years, had created a strategy for improving the whole network. You know, improving the professionalism on the air, and getting more people involved with major donations so we could expand the airspace. But they did put more attention on, like, improving the programming. And that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, the ones who were asked to maybe you know, give more information about what they were going to do the next day. You know, people looked at that as though they were being, but they felt like it was an outside force trying to tell them what to do. And so there was a real battle for control that started happening. And again, because of the internet, the 5 stations had never been able to collude together. There's always been listener revolts at all the stations since they started. And it's a great, fascinating organizational history. But this was the first time that the listener battles that were brewing at each station were able to work together. And then out of Berkeley and also here in New York, there was extremely high-level, serious organizing that was launched to overthrow the foundation, to force the board
stations.
and to take control of them. It's still a nonprofit, but
and that was the whole 2001. In the middle of it, the World Trade Center gets hit by it. Well, depends on
lots of big events.
Maybe the
happen.
whole at the heart of the whole thing in Pacifica
Bush
is whether or
got
not you
elected twice during the whole thing. I mean, there's a lot of big events that happen while Pacifica was embroiled in its own civil war.
The division between the two factions of Pacifica has something to do with the whole idea of whether or not it was a government plot to attack the World Trade Center, or if it really was a terrorist attack?
One of my friends in the Balkans, you know, experts that I met said, never trust a conspiracy when simple incompetence can explain it, you know, because it was incompetence.
That led to 9/11 and the troubles at WBAI.
And taking care of an organization. People don't necessarily want to look at organizations like Pacifica or other nonprofits as businesses, and so they're protecting their freedom and their independence. But what they don't realize is that if you don't cooperate with your resources and have some really clear strategic goals, you actually are vulnerable to people who will take the control of the network, and you know, they'll keep the jobs and they'll keep the airtime regardless of the impact on the foundation. In this case, what happened was that what I would call a phony baloney idea of democracy was used as a pretense to change the governance system. So they threw out the old bylaws, and now they have an election system which all 5 stations every couple years
$2 million
have to go through it. And you get a ballot in the mail, and you've got like 22 people that you have to rate in order of, you know, what is it called,
of course,
STV.
that leads to factions that support their slates.
Just like other politics, it's the most extreme that come out. And then, you know, from my vantage point.
So you have an extreme factional fight.
Well.
That happens at all the stations.
Yeah, but what happened though before the current fight is that they got rid of a lot of the professionals. They had to do that first.
Right. The people who made radios for a living.
So the people who've been battling each other for the last 12 years were kind of on the same side
Uh-huh.
to get rid of the old guard.
Yes.
And then once they got in control, the democracy of it is kind of misplaced, because decision making in an organization can't necessarily be by committee. And yet they've developed, instead of a democracy, they've developed a bureaucracy.
Uh-huh.
And if you go to the meetings of the local station boards,
I've been
or
to
the
them.
national
I was on the board for
boards,
3 years. Come on, I
you
got
know,
elected. I was on the
they're
Pacifica board.
embarrassing.
The WBAI LSP for 3 years. It was horrible. The worst experience I ever had in my life.
It ages you, it drains you. You know,
Yeah,
the
I'm
people
out
who
of
are
it.
left.
I came
that's
to
right.
beautiful Let Them Talk, Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Thank you, MNN,
Yeah,
for bringing us here, although it is an internecine world.
Well, and there's so much opportunity still for any media organization. And Pacifica has such an amazing history. Even though it might be on a down right now, it can still come up because it has so much history, and all we have to do in communications is serve the needs of the people.
Yeah.
You know, and if we can attract more artistic souls and make some changes, I think there's some changes afoot.
So what's happening with BAI? You're, like, WBAI is almost
Well, you should know
extinct.
more about that.
Yeah, right. But what led to this? How did the things come to the point where, like, they're ready to close down one of the stations? The main one, the one in New York City, the biggest market. How could that be possible?
They've lost listeners throughout the network. All the stations have lost listeners. They've lost donations. Listeners have gone elsewhere.
Is this about
They
the
also
programming,
have
or is it about
it's a lot about programming. They've lost a lot of talent.
And what's
in the
right?
network.
And what do they replace it with?
They've subcontracted everything. The biggest show, which is they still call it, you know, Pacifica's Democracy Now, but the main show is Democracy Now, but Pacifica pays, or is supposed to pay, you know, probably over $500,000 a year for that show. And then they subcontracted out the news division. They closed down the Pacifica News division, and they subcontracted with Free Speech Radio News and others. And for a while, you know, they were keeping up with the bills, but they haven't been able to. And here in New York, the expenses were a lot higher than any other station, you know.
And then Sandy came and knocked them back. When Sandy came, they knocked them out of
They were
the
already
location.
deeply in debt.
I know.
That was
the final,
you know,
nail in the
that
coffin.
was maybe what happens is that people refuse to admit how serious it is. I just listened to the last board meeting, a little bit of it.
Yeah.
And the new national director is considering.
Who's been on this air?
Yes,
She's a Summer
Reese.
Summer Reese was a guest on
Well,
this
she
air.
was from KPFK.
Yeah.
She was one of our leaders
And
in
you
the
can,
local station board.
You could
She did a good
watch
job.
her on YouTube, our YouTube channel, youtube.com/letemtalk, LETEMTALK. And when you go there and listen to the show, see the archives, you can type in Summer Reese, beautiful name, Summer, R-E-E-S-E, right? And listen to the program that she did with us on this air about a year ago.
She's doing a good job so far, and I hope people support her efforts, because it would be nice if maybe another nonprofit could come in and broadcast for a while in this area, because if you could find an organization that had talent and some resources, maybe they could create a better programming mix.
So you think it's
that
over for WBAI?
No, I just think that they need to have new blood. And really serve the community.
What do you think
in
of
a
this
way.
IMA, this
LMA?
LMA, right? That's what it is, to rent the air basically to one of these several other radio stations
I
in New
would
York?
call it more to have a contract with somebody to subcontract out operations.
Do you think that's a bad idea or a good idea?
No, I think it's a really great idea, because if you found someone with the right mix, and it comes down to the scope of work. It depends on what the bid is. But if you made sure that it was a nonprofit and that they need to work with volunteers and they do outreach with, you know, the schools and
actually do the job that WBAI should have been doing for a long time.
Then if you allow them to do that under a contract for, let's say, 5 or 6 years, maybe the listener base will get used to higher quality operations.
And be attracted to it.
And, you know, Pacifica can learn to do it on its own again.
But shouldn't it be the voice of the voiceless? WBAI? I mean, that was the whole idea. That was the slogan of the time, you know?
It's always been a free speech arena, and that's what they mean by, I mean, that's what the founders wanted. They didn't necessarily say that you have to talk only about politics, first of all. There's a lot of arts that has been covered over the years. The
New York's the heart and center of the country.
Well, it started as a classical music station, and it was donated to Pacifica. So the original supporters of WBAI were basically the classical music.
Right.
I've been thinking lately maybe they should turn it back into a classical music station.
They need one because they've all been driven out. You know? They've all been driven out. I'm sure classical fans would think that's a great idea.
Yeah, you know, just to get new perspective. And too many of the stations are repeating the same guests and the same party line, kind of talking to
left wing of the Democratic Party,
their own bubble. You know, I would say talking to themselves.
Right. It's like they all work for the Democratic Party basically, and they're all talking to each other at a meeting.
To solve the society's problems, you need to be thinking in new ways and be open to new ways. And I think Pacifica has become a little stodgy.
Right, a little stodgy. It's like on life support, you know, it's dying as we speak. And it's up to the new managers. Like, fortunately, I have to say that hope, right? We have Bob Hennelly, who is the new program director, who used to be at WNYC and left WNYC because of their anti-union biases.
So which he's a professional
Yes, and he loves unions, and he works with unions, and he's going to have the same. He speaks the language of Pacifica. Summer Reese, the executive director of Pacifica, speaks. She's lived in New York, was part of the activist scene in New York for environmental and homeless issues, and understands the language of the Pacifica people. They really have an opportunity to save it right now. They have the right people in place who are sensible yet speak the language of these crazy people. These outsiders, outlanders, political outlanders.
But they have to get rid of this whole democracy idea, because that has absorbed so many. Not only has it taken a lot of resources, but it's created a constant state of conflict.
Yeah. Absolutely, it's like totally. It was like going. It was horrible.
How can you create anything if you're constantly at war?
I didn't really understand it.
You know, and this is supposed to be.
I never. And I was on the board for 3 years. And I still couldn't understand what was going on there.
Yeah, I mean,
and I probably played into it as much as anybody. But all after the die had been cast, it was like, when the die is cast, what can you do? I mean, everybody just fights or leave.
Yeah, it's kind of embarrassing.
And I left, you know, ultimately. I know, and we hope that BAI pulls itself out of this hole. That there's good people in store who can do that. And help us out. So Nalini Lasiewicz knows a lot about Pacifica Radio, obviously. She knows a lot about Bosnia-Herzegovina. She's an incredible musician who wrote and sang that beautiful song we heard just a few minutes ago.
Can I do one shout out?
Yes, you must.
My niece Alexandra is getting married this week to Murphy, and I'm going to be joining them. I'm just so happy for them both, and they love the city. They've been so happy here.
Right. Have you been to New York before?
Oh, yeah.
New York City?
Showbiz Expo. We used to hold it at the Hilton.
Okay, great. So you've been here before. When was the last time you were in New York?
It's been over 10 years.
Oh, that's nice.
Really nice to be here.
All right, great. Welcome. Welcome. You came for a snowstorm from balmy 80-degree Los Angeles to
I was borrowing every
freezing. We were coming down the street here against the hurricane winds of 20 below zero. Right? Okay, well, then you'll remember New York.
Thank
Definitely.
You so much. I'm also
as I remembered LA.
Manhattan College too in the Bronx on Thursday. We have another business now. We have a tutor training school called Crossroads of Learning, and so I'm going to go up there and see their writing center and their learning center. It's going to be a nice week.
All right, great.
So we're parts of my life.
Right, part of it we share some things together, and we shared our involvement in Pacifica.
We want to see Pacifica thrive, and
but also our interest in education.
Yep, exactly.
We both are teachers, and we both went through the whole master's degree, MS Ed world, and went and the meat grinder of the New York City, or the American public school system, wherever you go, you in LA, myself in New York. It was
so interesting to watch you go through your training process too, and find out what was going on.
Yes.
A lot of classroom management you talked about.
Right, we deal with kids and learning about and understanding that, you know, seeing the damage that the system that the mayor put in was doing, and we hope the new mayor is going to really start to backpedal on putting so many resources into the charter school system.
Do you know much about the Common Core, what they're talking about, and how you implement that?
Yeah,
it sounds more holistic.
It takes everything that's happened. We're getting into a whole area. Everything that's happened in education in New York City and happening throughout the country is about taking power away from the teacher. And so the teacher was always the problem. The reason that students are failing, the reason we're falling behind the Russians and the Chinese and the Japanese and the other countries, and the Hungarians and the Costa Verdes, and every country in the world seems to be ahead of the United States in science and technological education, right, according to the official story, that somehow we have to catch up, and the only way to catch up is to take the power of teaching away from the teachers and put it into some governmental, legalistic jargon that can then
There's so much
standardize
bureaucracy
what
in all
everybody's
these,
going to learn.
You know, in the school systems and the municipalities, there's so much deeply
Right.
entrenched interests, and I you know, the idea that this public money is so precious.
Yeah.
Everybody involved in education needs to really focus and try
Yeah.
to do what's best for the long-term needs of these young people. I think a lot of money in
Yeah.
education is misspent.
Right. It's
I really do.
It's totally misspent. It's like it's a brainwashing
And the
machine.
teachers aren't spending it.
Remember, I had to become a teacher in the public school system to learn why I hated school. Right? Reminded me of it. Oh, now I remember why I hated it so much back in the 1970s in the Bronx and wherever. But so I went back to teach in the community where I learned, where I first went to school, and so that was interesting to see it from the other side of the desk.
Yeah.
Because it's difficult. There's a lot. The thing is, teaching and education does not solve all the social problems that are out there.
Exactly.
And you can't expect that it will. And because what they're saying is that somehow if you get an education, you'll get a good job. And there is no direct connection between a good education and a good job.
Not anymore.
Well, education should be connected anyway to life.
Right. Right.
It should be connected to, to me, the 70s when people were cutting school and where professors at the University of Wisconsin would flunk you if you actually were foolish enough to come to class, said that you learn in the streets, you learn in the protest movement, you learn fighting the Vietnam War. That was that era that I grew up in, and I love that era, and I wish we could redo it. Paulo Freire, the idea of turning the community into the learning experience.
Well, I've heard that there are trends where they're actually starting to talk about, hey, we should bring shop back. We should bring home economics back.
Yeah, that would
more
be great.
trades.
Yes.
The kids don't get to work with their hands enough.
Right.
They're certainly not reading books the way they used to.
It seems to be a strange fear that they'll get ahead of us in defense-related stuff if we don't churn out engineers and technicians.
It's sort of robotic what's happening.
Yeah.
They're turning kids into, and also the
no, forget history and social sciences.
But what about the cost of education? If these young people who want to go to school now, they're going to be indentured.
Yeah.
Slaves to their loans for years and years and years.
We're just beginning on this. Nalini Lasiewicz, who came from Los Angeles to join us on Let Them Talk. Thank you so much for coming. And we're having a wonderful conversation. We've had many of these kind of conversations in the years we've known each other. And Greg Gieselman, I wish he was here. I'm going to shout out for
Rest
him.
in peace.
The third of our trilogy. Rest in peace, Greg.
He was from the Houston
Great holidays.
station.
And we'll see you next year. We'll have some tape shows next couple of weeks. So see you then. That's it.
Thank you.
We did it. I told you it would be easy. It's fun.